Oh no! キラークイーン第3の爆弾
So, I recently made the mistake of watching a video from Cosmonautvarietyhour, with him talking about Jojo's Bizarre Adventure.
Obviously, the environment down here is all salt. The ceiling's salt, the floor is salt, the walls are salt, and to an extent, the air is salt. And you breathe that in, and you can constantly taste the salt.
I can almost taste the salt from here.
You never see it coming. You say that my mind is too fast for eyes.
Now, while I voiced my opinion on his opinions on Twitter a while ago, I'm not about to make a full-on movie explaining my issue with the guy's content. Although it certainly wouldn't be hard to do so, since apparently he doesn't understand what words mean.
Joel is not a fucking beloved character.
Beloved. To be dearly loved, or dear to the heart.
What? I don't get it.
But as I'm not interested in some jag-off in the comments getting triggered about how I apparently have issues with a big subbed YouTuber stirring up their massive audiences, and how apparently their fans love to point out how you can never question them even when they say,
No, I don't like JoJo's. I don't know, people just hate that I don't like JoJo's. So I'll tell you why, okay? And this isn't gonna be a well-formulated argument.
it just would drown in mediocrity. Which is why I might do it next month, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm not interested in that kind of video yet. Someday, my precious. Rather, I'd actually like to talk positively about JoJo. Now, love it or hate it, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has been ingrained in our culture for the internet to the point where I've actually made graphics that work with it. And while my own personal feelings about JoJo can be conflicted, like I find Giorno Giovanna to be the weakest of the JoJo protagonists in terms of character, but I can still find him entertaining, or that Josuke in Part 4 doesn't get all that much of his own and his own goddamn part dedicated to him, I'd say overall I think JoJo, while not the best series around, is one of the ones that I do enjoy and go back to at times. So after hearing the dumb opinions of Cosmonaut, Mongoloid! I binged the first 4 series, and after a lot of thinking, I actually want to talk about probably the best episode of the animated series up to date. But before we get to that, I want to point something out that really appeals to me about the series. And I would wager that a lot of people have a fond with the series that it be based on the psychological fights throughout the series. It's easy to devolve into things like Dragon Ball Z's fist fighting, and is one of the worst things I consider about the Dragon Ball series, since it devolved from not just throwing fists, getting bigger power levels, and shooting laser beams at everyone. Visually, it looks interesting, most of the time.
No, I'm not sure about that one. I don't know if that checks out.
But it just gets boring as it becomes extremely predictable. But with JoJo, a lot of the fights often turn into more psychological chess games. The fight between Dio and Jotaro are probably the best examples of this because while Dio clearly has a powerful advantage over Jotaro, and unlike Joseph, Jotaro doesn't have Joseph's Helm-on abilities to defend himself, Jotaro needs to be able to be flexible with what he's got. Or from when Part 4 when Josuke goes against Highway Star and has to use his powers creatively. There's a lot of fights that this can fall into, and there are a lot of fights that I would consider really great. But I gotta say, probably the best fight in the entire series doesn't actually throw a single punch. A finger does get broken though. Yep, probably the best fight in all of JoJo to me is the fight against Elder Darby. For some reason, if you haven't seen this fight or you disagree with me, click off this video, go watch the episode, and then come back. Don't worry, I'll just be over here sipping on the drink waiting for you to come back to argue with me. Good, now that they're gone, let's set the groundwork. This episode's setup is in the previous episode. The group has finally reached Cairo and are now looking for Dio's hideout, unsuccessfully. It's then that the group is given a lead by this mysterious man, with the prospect of giving the group the information that they need. But he's not going to give that information for free and offers to know him with a bet. But as we learn, this isn't a normal man. This is Daniel J. Darby, the king of games.
It's time to do. Shut up!
and with his stand Osiris, he challenges the group to wager their souls in order to save Polnareff, starting with Joseph Joestar. And unfortunately, Joseph is defeated, and his soul is also captured. So let me explain why this is important in context of the best episode. This establishes how much of a threat Darby is, especially considering the amount of oddity up to this point. The Joestar group has faced up to, and not limited to, an old hag that could control people through their wounds with fog, a man who attacks through reflections, and a giant metal face. And I feel the need to point out that all the enemies that the Joestar Egyptian tour group at this point have had one real big loss, and are turned out to be able to fake out death. Although I'm probably using the wrong term. This was the first enemy that actually managed to put the Egyptian tour in such a bind where half their group was effectively killed off by one man who managed to be smart enough to trick them. You see, we're given two pieces of important information concerning Darby. The first being is that Darby is smart, and knows how to make effective use of his stand despite it not being made for combat. Darby's whole shtick is to get people to wager their souls against him in a contest, and should they feel like they lose, even if they lose a 50-50 wager, he'll claim their souls. And the only way to get a person's soul back is if Darby feels like he lost a wager. So this is a battle that the Joestar Egyptian tour group would have to deal with in order to save their allies. The second piece of information that we get is Darby is also a cheater, and that his moral code is that unless you're caught cheating, it's not cheating. And that's something to remember, because how he defeated Joseph Joestar, who was also cheating in the game they had, but Darby had out-cheated Joseph with some careful sleight of hand and chocolate. Because in the end, a winner is a winner despite how they win, which, funny enough, is something that Dio echoes in the final episode of Stardust Crusaders. So not only is this a mindset that we have been seeing from the enemy stand users, most of which are willing to do whatever they can in order to win against the Joestars, and most of the time it ended up with them But here, that's not going to get the crew anywhere, since Darby has complete control of the situation, and even if the crew were to beat him into a bloody pulp, there's no guarantee that they'd freed Polnareff or Joseph's souls. And with that, we can finally talk about the actual episode, with Jotaro challenging Darby to a game, with his soul on the line. Obviously, one of the reasons why this episode is probably the best for me, or at the very least the most memorable, is that it's such a detachment from the rest of Stardust Crusaders, with the match being a game of poker. We start the episode with a fun little move from Jotaro. A lot of the time in JoJo, Jotaro's stand Stardust Platinum.
It's Star Platinum! What do you mean Stardust Platinum? What? Dude, come on! Oh man, dude, you gotta be kidding me. Stardust Platinum?
Doesn't actually use a lot of its other skills. One of its abilities that Jotaro uses here is that the ability to use Enhanced Eyesight. Most of the time, Jotaro's stand is used as a
smack the goofy out you.
Which makes sense, but it's really a shame that Jotaro doesn't use his stand in more creative ways. Hell, one of the reasons why I like Josuke in Part 4 is how he's able to actually be really creative with his stand's abilities, even to the point of seeing him break a moving motorcycle apart and reform it. But while I do appreciate Crazy Diamond, screw you localization laws, back to the original fight that I was talking about, it's more or less that Jotaro is forced to use his ability not against another stand, but to win against another person who, for all intents and purposes, is just a regular guy. Just highlighting how dangerous this person is, someone who could easily fall to a single punch, and Darby knows that and uses it to his advantage. That being said, throughout the episode we learn that Darby is quite a dangerous cheater, knowing card techniques, being able to count cards by only touch, and even has everyone in the cafe working for him, as well as those outside the building. Literally, the deck is stacked against Jotaro, and he's destined to lose. Before I continue with the rest of the plot, I want to take a moment to talk about the camera movements as well as the art direction in JoJo. I've talked about this before, and a lot of people have before me, what with the over-the-top camera angles and the sudden changes of color that can make a scene all the memorable for people, and this was something that spans across all the anime. Despite how after Stardust Crusaders there was a shift in art style, and the same with Golden Wind, the color changes for intense scenes and battles still remain. But that technique being used for a game of poker, I don't know, that just seems to scream at me even more over the top as it's making something that's extremely mundane, at least in comparison to that we've been seeing in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure at this point, even better. While the series doesn't need to have the mundane in order to make it more bizarre, by having a more mundane activity being the focus of the bizarre situation, it adds a bit of flair for the show. So when I see a scene like this, it really sticks out even more in my mind. Disagree if you like, but hey, this is just an episode that I like. Especially when Jotaro is backed into a corner because of Darby's cheating. So there's only one thing that Jotaro can do now. Bluff his ass off! And from here, it's basically Jotaro messing with Darby throughout the entire episode. Not looking at his cards, accepting the raises of Darby's bets, and then using Star Platinum to light a cigarette. It also gives us the example of the worst kind of censorship from Japan ever. Where we see Jotaro's entire face being covered up by this black mist by simply lighting a cigarette. Like, I know about the terrors of much worse censorship. Trust me, I've lived through that crap! But this, when I saw this originally aired, I was just rolling my eyes. The thing about this episode is, while it's a stark contrast to the rest of JoJo, the stakes are still just as high. And all that's happening is a game of cards. It's a much welcome breath of fresh air from all the previous episodes that had the group be in the clutches of a stand user, and a climactic battle ensues. Sure, you can have outliers such as the sun, and I'd be lying if the formula didn't really go out of its way to make things interesting, but Part 3 had become essentially a Monster of the Week show. And while Darby himself falls into that, it's not so much a battle and still manages to still be quite the threat, just by gambling. And we still have that tension that's in the episode as well. And the best part? It's because it actually works with Jotaro's personality. His aloof and crass nature really work in this situation. Let me put it like this. One of the biggest complaints I hear about Part 3 is that Jotaro really isn't that compelling of a character. At least in this initial part. And don't get me wrong, he's a definite fan favorite among the JoJos. But when the recent insurgence of anime adaptation came out, there were a lot of people who were just watching the show and outright proclaimed that Jotaro was stunted and barely allowed any emotions.
There really just aren't enough traits or characteristics to get me invested in him as the main character. If I look past the fact that he's just like really cool and edgy, then he's got nothing.
I really hate it when people use the word edgy, as if that actually means anything in this internet state. Not only has this term been watered down like the dreaded Mary Sue, but it also doesn't help that it's been used to describe almost anything that has an attitude. Look, in the original manga, there was a bit more to Jotaro's personality. He's not as stoic all the time, he occasionally smiles more than just a smirk. It's not much, but there is more personality to Jotaro than what people give him credit for. Like when he says this.
だがな、空城か。いや、ジョースター家には伝統的な戦いの発想法があってな。一つだけ残された戦法があったぜ。それは逃げる。
We can see he's starting to care for his grandfather and starting to connect with him. Yeah, it's not much, but considering that he's taking a page out of the old man's book, whom he just met a couple weeks ago, it's something to consider. But I'll admit that Jotaro is mostly portrayed as aloof. Hell, even Araki himself has admitted that. And while that's true, it actually plays really well in this portion. A poker face is exactly what's needed, and it works extremely well when Jotaro refuses to look at his cards after he's given his first loss to Darby. And it's just amazing to see Darby lose his cool as Jotaro continues to mess with him. To me, this is one of the best episodes because it actually plays with Jotaro's aloof nature, and frankly, it's amazing to see everyone's reaction when Jotaro continues to up the ante while still refusing to look at his cards. And with the possibility of Jotaro using Star Platinum to switch his cards under Darby's nose, with Jotaro making a little seed of doubt grow and grow within Darby's mind, it's essentially having Jotaro use the same technique that Darby was using in order to defeat Joseph by messing with the mind of his opponent. And to top it off, when Jotaro raises the stakes to a point where Darby can't match, betting his mother's soul, he ups it up even more. The art direction here really pushes the stress that Darby is feeling, that his mind and heart is racing, and you can easily tell that he's in deep conflict. The odd coloring, the facial expression, and to top it off, it plays Jotaro's theme at the right moment. And this is something that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is really good at with its musical direction. Like, let's take a moment and talk about the original OVA version of this scene.
I'm not finished. There's the little matter of a raise I'd like to make. What the? You're raising? But you're out of chips! I'm gonna raise you my mother's soul. What? Your mother's?
Jotaro! Is it really alright to assume that? Those cards will surely win, right, Jotaro?
It's awful.
Like, you can see there's similar elements and camera angles going on, but the more recent incarnation really speaks out a lot more with its vibrant coloring and choice of music, as well as when not to play the music. You see, when it comes to using background music, especially in a tense scene, knowing when not to play music is just as important as when to play it. Like, there are obvious points in the updated animated version when the music cuts out just so Jotaro can make an important statement, betting his mother's soul and telling Darby what his bet should be. It's an effective use of music that can highlight the tension of a scene, and it's a technique that's not really that all appreciated nowadays. And thus, we finally get to the biggest tension of this episode, Darby's confliction in wagering so dangerous bets. Cause if Darby loses, not only will he lose any leverage he had over the Joestar group, but he'll be forced to give up Dio's secret, and put him at a disadvantage, and thus make him go on the run until Dio hunts him down and kills him. And if Jotaro was bluffing, why would he wager not only his own soul, but Abdul's, Kakyoin's, and even his own mother's soul? And he has no idea if Jotaro has been cheating or not, since Star Platinum has been shown to be so fast that Darby's unable to catch the stand and give Jotaro a fancy drink. And Darby doesn't have a choice here. Either call and take the risk that he'll lose, or forfeit and lose. The battle ends with Darby freaking out as he tries to call. And ultimately, he faints on his feet. And Jotaro wins! The souls of Polnareff and Joseph, as well as all of Darby's victims, are freed. And we finally see Jotaro's hand. And as much as a punch to the face,
Your hand was shit! Absolute shit!
it turns out it was just a bluff. Part 3 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is probably one of the most iconic parts of JoJo, since it's one where Jotaro Kujo is the main character and has been shown in other forms of media, as well as having the part being the most used in outside media. It's not perfect, far from it, and as far as the animated series, Part 4 for me is probably my favorite part, but it's far from what I would consider a really good series. Stardust Crusaders, however, was when the series really took off, especially if you consider that this is the series of manga and anime that came out during a different time period. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure came out in the late 1980s, with Part 3 coming out on the tail end of the 80s itself. And in that time, people enjoyed the stoic badass characters a lot more, with Jotaro actually being an icon for the rebellious nature that was stimulated during that time period in Japan. And although we don't really see it, Part 3 is almost 30 years old at this point. There's going to be some writing in that seems reductive to us nowadays, especially when there's such a saturation to the amount of media that we consume on an insane rate. So I think Part 3 should be given a bit of a pass considering how old it is. But regardless, this part of JoJo may not be the best, but it was still a fun journey, and it still had my favorite episode and battle of JoJo, and one I still haven't gotten the same feeling in future parts. That's just me though, and I'm curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are, not just on this episode of JoJo, but anything related to it. I'm MangaKamen, and remember to examine your fandom.